Hey all, Ron here from Military Images Magazine with a new episode of Life on the Civil War Research Trail. Today, I want to take you to the Naval School Hospital at Annapolis, Maryland on a cold, brisk January day in 1865. The wards in the hospital are filled with beds containing sick and wounded soldiers. Some of those patients are fighting their last battle against disease or perhaps an amputation gone wrong, their lives slowly ebbing away. The luckiest of those patients might have had a mother, a father, a sister, a brother, or maybe even a comrade with them who had served alongside. They're there with them now, hovering over those beds, little scenes playing out throughout the hospital. While that was happening, you might have had a nurse, a surgeon, a clergyman, a steward, or other attendants slowly moving about, delivering comfort in the form of water, lunch, linens, towels, dressings, maybe a deck of playing cards, some writing paper, a Bible, something to give folks comfort while they were in various stages of recovery or dealing with death that was sure to come. Now, I want to take you to one of those beds in particular. In this particular bed, there's a woman, and her name is Rosanna Moore Billing. She's pictured here. She was a veteran nurse who had cared for countless soldier boys in the very same hospital. Now, Rose was the patient, and her life hung in the balance. Her life journey began 3 decades earlier in Washington, D.C., not too far away. Her father, William, was a paymaster's clerk in the War Department, went on to serve as colonel of the District of Columbia Militia, and held several local government offices before his untimely passing in 1843, when Rose was all of 11 years old. This left her widowed mother, Rebecca, to raise Rose and her 4 sisters alone. Somehow her mother, Rebecca, managed to keep everyone together, keep the family intact, and raise them to be young, vibrant women who were busy living their lives. And then the war came. When it did, Rose expressed a strong desire to serve as a nurse. And this was not a surprise to anyone who knew her because she was a deeply sympathetic individual. They also knew her to be frail and delicate, and this was a big cause of concern for everyone who knew her. Fear for her health, especially from her mother, was a big worry. Eventually, her mother, who was very reluctant at first, came around to the idea that Rose could be an Army nurse and gave her consent for Rose to apply. Well, she did. When the war was only a few months old, Rose put that application in to Washington, to the growing corps of nurses managed by Dorothea Dix. And also the U.S. Sanitary Commission was involved. In the autumn of 1861, that first autumn of the war, well, that's when the application was accepted and Rose received her first assignment at a place called the Indiana Hospital, which was located in the Patent Office building right in downtown DC. Rose proved her value immediately. According to one biographer, Rose was, quote, a young lady of most winning manners, end quote. A fellow nurse described her as, quote, one of the most devoted and conscientious workers she ever knew, an earnest Christian, caring always for the spiritual as well as the physical wants of her men, end quote. Rose stayed at the Indiana Hospital for a while, eventually moved into Virginia to Falls Church, just on the outskirts of the capital city, and then on to Fredericksburg. That was all in 1862. In early 1863, she moved again, this time going to Annapolis. The same thing she did when she was in Washington and Virginia, inspiring everyone around her with her faith and devotion. She did it again at Annapolis. Particularly impressed were surgeons because she had an ability to bring back fever patients considered hopeless. That became her specialty. In fact, one source credited her with saving scores of soldiers, fever-ridden soldiers. She was the person who was able to get in there and help. However, the long hours was no real time off. You just kept going and going until the emotional and physical strain would break you down, take a toll on your health. Rose's biographer observed, quote, though she herself felt that she was exceeding her strength, or as she expressed it, wearing out, she could not and would not leave her soldier boys while they were so ill, end quote. On 2 occasions while she was at Annapolis, she fell so dangerously sick that she had to take breaks from her duties to recover. I should add, this is not uncommon. Many nurses had the same exact dedication to duty. They needed to be there. They felt they were compelled to be with their patients to make sure they recovered. The emotional investment in making sure that those soldiers had everything they wanted, every care was up to these nurses. She did that until about New Year's Day of 1865, where the constant wearing down eventually struck her with illness, typhus, fever, the same kind of fever that she was known to help those soldiers recover from. Now she had it, tossing and turning in bed, burning with fever. She fought that battle as hard as she could, but she didn't win it. On January 14th, 1865, she succumbed to typhoid fever. She was 32 years old. Word of her death spread throughout the nursing community. Some of those who knew her and others that knew of her hailed her and honored her as a martyr to the profession of being an Army nurse. Her professionalism celebrated by many. Very many people disappointed with her passing. One of those nurses who heard about Rose's tragic fate was a man who tended to patients in Washington. You know his name, the poet and writer Walt Whitman. Here's what Whitman wrote about her. Quote, a lady named Miss or Mrs. Billings, who has long been a practical friend of soldiers and a nurse in the Army, and had become attached to it in a way that no one can realize but him or her who has had experience, was taken sick earlier this winter, lingered some time, and finally died in the hospital, end quote. Whitman added, quote, it was her request that she should be buried among the soldiers, and after the military method, her coffin was carried to the grave by soldiers with the usual escorts, buried, and a salute fired over the grave. This was at Annapolis a few days since, end quote. So revered, so honored was she that the soldiers that she saved, the soldiers that watched her as she did her work, other members of the medical community, they gave her a military funeral, the highest honor that a nurse could probably ever hope to receive. Rose's remains were later removed from Annapolis to Washington to Congressional Cemetery and appropriately interred alongside her father and a brother who had died in infancy. So there you had the story of Rose Billings, a brave, gallant, and heroic nurse who specialized in fever patients until she herself became one and paid the ultimate price. Thanks for listening. We'll see you on the next episode of Life on the Civil War Research Trail.